We will be once again in 1 Samuel this morning, finishing up our three-part message on Hannah. Our first two parts, we have seen the suffering and the distress of Hannah over her barrenness when her rival had plenty. We saw the trouble that was in their family, and then we saw her bitter prayer to the Lord because of how difficult her situation was. And ultimately her vow that if God gave her the son that she desired, that she would give him back to the service of the Lord. Today we'll be at the conclusion of that. Samuel has been born, and now the time of sacrifice has come. So we will be looking at that. You know, it can be hard to say goodbye to someone you care deeply about. Even when you know it's for the best, even when they have to go. Even when the person leaving wants to go. Because we fear the void that will remain after they've gone. The void in our life, emotionally, physically. Every parent knows that they'll have to say goodbye to that child that they once held tiny in their arms someday. But we usually do it in stages. There's the first day at school, and then they're gone on weekdays. And then there's college, and you send them off for a while, but they're back in the summer, they're back at the holidays. And then finally there'll be a moving van on the horizon someday, if they move out and get a place of their own. These days that doesn't happen quite as much, but eventually they're going to leave. But for Hannah, as we've been learning and studying Hannah, that goodbye is going to come much earlier in life. Let's begin with verses 21 through 23 of chapter 1. It says this: When the man Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, "After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will serve there always." "Do what seems best to you," Elkanah, her husband, told her. "Stay here until you've weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word." So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. We begin by seeing that Elkanah continues to follow the Lord. As was his habit, he takes the whole family up to Shiloh every year to offer the annual sacrifice. This is something he was doing before God had answered men's prayer, and it is something he continues to do now. It reminds us that for him this obedience was not contingent upon times being good or on times being bad. It was simply an act of obedience that he and his family were committed to. It also tells us in this passage that he went to fulfill his vow. And that's interesting because we've talked a lot about Hannah's troubles and her vow to the Lord, but we have not seen anything about Elkanah's vow. He evidently had his own promise to keep. What kind of vow did he make? We actually have no idea because the text doesn't tell us. But perhaps Hannah told him of her promise to God, and in order to support her, perhaps he made the same promise. In that case, he too would be obligated to offer a sacrifice and thanksgiving to God because that prayer had been answered. We see here that Hannah stays behind with Samuel. That's new, because in the past she always went up to the Shiloh with her husband for the sacrifice. That was what she normally did. But it doesn't seem all that unusual to us in another sense, because a new mother would be likely to stay behind with her infant son in order to care for him. Although I think in this case there may have been something else to it as well. I don't think that Hannah was ready to visit the place where she would say goodbye to her son in just a few years. To know that you have a difficult task, a difficult choice in front of you is one thing. To be reminded of it is another. And I think that staying behind allows Hannah to cherish the time she has with Samuel, to live in the present. She tells her husband, "After the boy is weaned," and you might be saying, "Okay, I've never heard that word before. What on earth is that?" That's not a phrase we use much anymore. It literally meant when the child is dealt fully with. In other words, when you are past the time of infancy, when you're actually into childhood, when that mother's care is not quite so every moment of every day necessary. For them, it probably meant around 3 years old. We usually delay that a little bit in our culture. But think of it like this. It is like when we send a child off to kindergarten, we let others begin to train them. We let others begin to help us raise them. Our society feels that at that age they are physically and emotionally and mentally ready for a new step in life. Hannah says, after that, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always. This is the fulfillment of her vow. Hannah is letting her son go far earlier in life than she would have otherwise. It is as if that tearful moment of saying goodbye at the school bus on that first day of kindergarten is permanent and not just for half a day. So imagine it like that. You see, for Samuel, his career choice of assisting at the tabernacle has been made a long time ago. He will grow up amongst the priests and other workers who live there. He will literally live within the tabernacle itself. Now, I need to say something here. Lest any flustered parent get any crazy idea, we don't need your 3-year-old living here at the church as the pastor's assistant. That's not really necessary. You don't need to make that vow. I'm okay. You can go ahead and keep them. Just thought I'd throw it out there. Don't want any surprises tomorrow morning. Elkanah responds this way. He says, may the Lord make good his word. And that's an interesting translation because it also could be, may the Lord make good your word. Either which way, it means the same thing. Elkanah agrees to have Hannah wait and come to the tabernacle in a couple of years as long as she remains willing to fulfill her vow. You see, it would be the culmination of both her promise and God's providence when Samuel is brought to the tabernacle. If they were to turn back now, it would be a betrayal of God's goodness to them, and that is not an option worth contemplating. Verses 24 through 28 continue. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli, and said to him, as surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you, praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. Now before they can continue, the first thing they need to do is to make an offering in fulfillment of the vow. She brings a bowl, amount of flour, and a skin of wine, because that is the prescribed offering. If you look in the law, that is what is said you must bring when a vow has been fulfilled. Hannah, like Elkanah, is careful to obey the law in every aspect. But think about that sacrifice for a moment. That is not a small sacrifice out of a family's budget. A little bit of flour, maybe no big deal. A little bit of wine, that's not the end of the world. But to bring a young 3-year-old bull and sacrifice it is no small thing. That means this is a serious business, fulfilling a vow. Notice also this. That Hannah and Samuel present the sacrifice together before she takes him to Eli, because he is himself the answer from God to her prayer. He is the fulfillment of her vow. For Samuel, this is the very first time of many times in his life that he will participate in that sacrificial system. That system that enabled the covenant with the people of Israel to function. This boy is going to grow up with daily reminders of the cost of sin in blood. And Hannah says to Eli, I am the woman who stood here beside you. I'm sure Eli had no idea that when he quickly made that blessing years ago, that 3 years later, Hannah would be standing before him with the results of her answered prayer right there. One would assume that this is the first time anybody's done something like this. And one would assume that Eli has absolutely no idea what Hannah's about to do. After all, he may not have forgot her and that embarrassing moment 3 years earlier when he accused her of being drunk when she was praying, but I'm pretty sure that Eli had no idea what she was praying for. Therefore, he is unaware of what is about to happen. Hannah reminds him what she prayed for. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. How often do you have such a concrete and obvious answer to prayer? Sometimes things happen and we think, oh man, prayer was in that. And we really think that it had something to do with it. Because we know that prayer works. But to literally see the results of it would be awe-inspiring. To know without a doubt that this was the result of prayer. Especially a prayer like this. There is life because of this prayer. I think Eli would have been encouraged to see such faith among the people of God, and to once again be told that the Lord is remembering his people. He's probably thinking to himself, good for you. God is good. God answers prayer. And then Hannah says this, so now I give him to the Lord. And I think Eli's first thought was, say what? Can you repeat that, please? What's going on here? There was probably a moment of shock before Eli realized that Hannah intends to leave this 3-year-old in the care of a man old enough to be his grandfather. Certainly there were plenty of other people there who served at the temple, both men and women, who would have pitched in and helped raise Samuel. He may have had a whole village of people raising him. But ultimately, the responsibility for this boy rests with Eli. Remember also, Eli is a man who failed when raising his own 2 sons. And now he is going to be entrusted with raising a child given to him by God. Any pressure there for Eli? You screwed up the first time. Let's up the ante. You might also be thinking at what Eli was thinking. Of what use is a child to the Lord? How can a child serve the Lord? Certainly, though, we know that God had a plan in mind. He is the one that closed Hannah's womb, only to open it again when she made her vow. This young boy is supposed to be here. He is supposed to be in this place at this time. Next week, we will encounter a similar situation where God prepares the way for the birth of John the Baptist, the man whose job was to render people to hear Jesus. And we will have similar questions. Here is the question, what will Samuel become? If God wanted this boy here, why is he here? Why would God go through such trouble? We'll have to wait on that. Hannah continues, for his whole life he will be given over to the Lord. Makes us wonder, did Hannah see her son Samuel after this? Of course she did. He only was a day's journey away from his family's village and where they lived. He must have visited them from time to time and vice versa. And Hannah would have continued to come to the tabernacle at least yearly for the annual sacrifice. It was more for him like a boarding school. We don't do that much anymore these days, but it used to be fairly common, where the kids were raised principally by the school and only occasionally saw their parents. She was still his mother, but his care was given over to the Lord. Does that make it any easier for him? Could any of the mothers here today contemplate walking away from one of your kids? No, don't stop and think about which one you might contemplate that from. Simply contemplate it in the abstract. You don't get to choose necessarily. Let alone the firstborn, for whom you had so long waited. Could you walk away? We might expect that at this moment, Hannah would be brokenhearted by the cost of her vow. Yet if we were to read the first part of chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, in Hannah's prayer, we would see not brokenheartedness, but triumph and victory in her words for the people of God over their foes. And especially she exalts in the great reversals that God brings about, where the weak and the poor and the barren triumph over the rich and the strong and the firm. Whatever level of pain Hannah felt at this moment, she considered this to be a victory and not a defeat. Her focus was on the prize, her son Samuel, not on the price, the cost of herself. Notice the last bit of the verse. And he worshiped the Lord there. Thus begins the time of Samuel, growing and learning and training under Eli. Remember, Eli's natural sons are immoral men. They're a blot on their father's service to the Lord. Perhaps this adopted son will someday redeem Eli. We need to continue. It would be an interesting story if we stopped here. If we only left the story with Hannah leading Samuel at the tabernacle, but it would be missing something. It would be missing the crucial component of why this all happened in the first place. Why did this happen? And we would also be missing the sense of catharsis that we need, that we will only get when we hear the rest of the story, when we know what happens to Hannah and Elkanah from here. We can't just leave them and forget about them. So let's skip ahead and look at verses 18 to 21 of chapter 2. But Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went out with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." Then they would go home. And the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. Here we see that Samuel was ministering before the Lord, and it says a boy wearing a linen ephod. And that might not mean a lot to us. But here we see that even as a small boy, Samuel is wearing the garb of a priest at the tabernacle. He's dressing like one of them. That's unusual for a kid this young to be doing that. And it is doubly unusual for a non-Levite. He doesn't belong to the tribe of the priests, but he is living and acting like one of them. Clearly, Eli and everyone else recognized the potential of this child. There was no better place for him to be than serving before the altar of the Lord. So they put him there. Notice also Hannah's visits and her gifts. Each year when Hannah and Elkanah came up to Shiloh for the annual sacrifice, they visited their son. Only natural for them to do that. And each year Hannah made new clothes for her son to wear. For her, it would have been a touching labor of love to make those clothes during the year, to know that she would be giving them and seeing her son again. It would have been, it would have been a way that connected mother and son, despite the distance between them. Eli blesses them. He realizes the value of Samuel that God has sent him. He knows the piety and the faithfulness of both Elkanah and Hannah. He would be happy to bless them both. Notice his blessing is straightforward, and it would be something appreciated and desired by both of them. May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord. Nothing wrong with praying for what your obvious need is, and it certainly is what he blesses them for. Now we know that a second child can never replace one that you had somehow lost one way or another. We know that that's not the way it works. But there is still joy. There still is joy for Hannah in raising other children that would be a blessing to her in recognition of her obedience to God. Notice how gracious God is to Hannah. As is God's way, he doesn't simply give Hannah one son for the son that she willingly offered. He gives her 3, and he gives her 2 daughters as well. By that time, Hannah has gone from being a social outcast and the target of her rival's bitterness to being a woman clearly blessed by God in the eyes of her people. Nobody would consider Samuel to be a fluke at this point. with 5 other children following after him. Word of Hannah's victory, of her faithfulness, of her vow, and God's goodness to her would have spread far and wide. And everyone who came to the tabernacle would have had their eyes on Samuel, wondering who this child would someday become. And notice this line. Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. What an amazing and unique upbringing he had. Each and every day for Samuel was filled with the business of God, of sacrifices and offerings and prayer and worship every day of the week. It's an example for us all about how we should raise up godly children. Make sure they spend a lot of time in the presence of the Lord. Make sure that they have that positive influence so that it will be felt along with the spiritual training that their parents give them. Reminds me of something that I learned this week. We had a meeting this week with some county agency people and church people talking about the results of the student survey. You might not be aware that they do a survey 8th, 10th, and 12th grade throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania schools. Some of them participate, some don't. The local results were this. They asked kids about 40 different things that could be assets to them, that could keep them out of drugs, that could keep them out of making bad choices, keep them in school. 40 different assets that they might have, from family to social things. Guess what came in last, according to the students? The least effect on them was the church, was religious things. That was where they felt least connected out of 40 things. You imagine trying to raise teenagers without that help, without that influence to help them keep from going astray. Now we know the task that lies before us in this community. Teenagers that don't feel connected to their churches. We know what needs to be done. We know what they need and what they're not getting. Back to Samuel. We have as of yet not answered that question. For what purpose did God need Samuel? Well, I'm sorry to tell you, you're going to have to wait. Because next week we begin our Christmas series beginning with John the Baptist. You can and you are capable of continuing to read 1 Samuel on your own and finding out. But for a sermon message, you're going to have to wait until the new year for that. So what do we conclude? We've looked at Hannah for 3 weeks now. What are our conclusions? What do we walk away from when we've looked at her sorrow and then her triumph and now her sacrifice? These lessons stick out to me. Number 1, that misfortune isn't always our own making. This was not her responsibility. She didn't do this to herself. Sometimes it serves to strengthen us for the challenge that lies ahead. Sometimes misfortune comes in our life to make us stronger because we need to be stronger. Secondly, that God in His wisdom and love may put His people through a time of trial in order to accomplish among them great things. We might prefer to always have good times, but sometimes God brings us into the valleys and into the dark places because there He accomplishes great things that would not have happened otherwise. Thirdly, that our prayers should come honestly from our hearts. We learned that from Hannah. Even if your prayers are bitter, even if your prayers are difficult, pray them from the heart. Fourthly, we learned this, that if we are faithful, God will be gracious. We may not get the results that we want, but we will find grace and mercy in our hour of need. And lastly, we learned this from Hannah, that even though moral living, such as faithfulness and honor, are their own reward and good and should be a part of our character for their own sake, we have learned that God delights in blessing His people when they serve Him.